look, part of this, what I was hoping to do in this conversation, I've got some climate-related questions I wanted to pose to you, but also to get your feedback on Vita Sapien philosophy. Um,
It, it's the best guy. It is the absolute best, I'm telling you. It's amazingly good.
Table that I sent to you, which was produced by Lee and Simons on the basis of the science report, that was basically saying that there were looking at six of the major climate models. We're all basically saying that we're going to be something over 2.5 degrees by 2050. The fundamental question that I've got is that we've got this model called the IPCC science reports that come out every 5 years. That, for example, the Australian government is using as its kind of climate change Bible or frame of reference. And yet it seems that the reality of the world is fundamentally different to what's actually written in the IPCC 5 yearly reports. Is that true?
Yes and no. What I say about the IPCC is that it's definitely an essential source of the most reliable information. And you can find it projecting all kinds of terrible increasing impacts, that's for sure. So they're a very good support for somebody like myself. Where they fall down is in two places. They don't do risk at all. Okay, and that's a huge omission, obviously. The other thing is they do not do the very worst impacts. They sort of mention the very worst, and that's about it. You probably are aware that the worst global warming impacts, which are feedbacks to global warming, they don't include. It's not just permafrost. They don't include any of the other ones at all. Now, of course, the problem with the IPCC is they're not a scientific body. It's presented as a scientific body, but it's a hybrid, and it's unique. It has government representatives sitting on the panel, and they scrutinize everything that the scientists put out. So governments really sort of permit the scientists to uh, put things out. So I think that's where the IPCC falls down. I think that they have these negotiations, I mean, the scientists, first of all, negotiate to decide on what they can agree on the science, well, that doesn't happen in the world of science. And then secondly, they negotiate with these government representatives, and that's absolute never happens. It's a total no-no. So it's complicated.
Um, and because it comes out, my understanding is that the science report comes out every 5 years,
Mhm.
but to get a paper into the science report, it needs to have been peer reviewed, but secondly, in the public for 2 years before it gets considered for inclusion into the list of papers. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh no, that's right. They have improved that. They have a deadline, of science that they will look at as they're preparing the forthcoming assessment. But they have definitely improved that. So they include science, which is more recent. But you're quite correct. I mean, there's an inevitable delay. That's largely well, it's been compensated to a large degree by a group out of Leeds, England, Piers Forster and his team, and they are now, because of what you say, because of this very thing, they are now putting out every year what they call climate change indicators update. So that's the scientific response to that criticism, which is a very real criticism, obviously. The WMO puts out State of the Climate at least once a year, and another document that they put out, which is on greenhouse gases. So it's not just the IPCC. So there's UNEP, of course, United Nations Environment Program, and they put out probably for me, what is the most important report, which is called the GAP report, and that covers in detail, but it's not hard to understand in detail where we're at with emissions, where governments are going to go with emissions, and where governments say they're going to go with emissions, and what's happening with emissions. So there's one big thing that but all those groups are agreed on. However, like a number of things, it's not out there at all. It's not getting mentioned. And that is, according to the IPCC and UNEP and WMO, we already had to have global emissions in decline, not just from 1.5 degrees C, which of course is long gone, but also for 2 degrees C. So that was put very, very clearly several times in the last assessment, 2022. So and that's the most important thing that the IPCC could possibly do, is to tell the world this is your absolute deadline. But I feel the scientists are letting us down there because they never mention it.
Mm. So, okay, so for one word to, I guess here's a broader question, because I've always found myself with respect to climate, finding all of these different sources in trying to come up with my own interpretation of that. And if we were to take the IPCC as a frame of reference and then bring in the climate change indicators update, the state of the climate report from the WMO, and then the UNEP GAP report, that seems to be, from what you're saying, a way to get the best.
Yep.
Okay. Is there a single source you can go to get all of that sort of in one place? Because, I mean, for most people that want to get their head across this thing, they're simply not going to have the wherewithal to go and synthesize all of that information.
That's a great question. Originally, when I tried to develop the Climate Emergency Institute, that of course was one of the things that I aimed on doing. But I've got so much stuff piled on that website now that it probably gets buried. So I should probably redo. Well, I will redo that, Guy. I definitely will redo that. Yeah.
Mm. Okay, you're the source of reference.
Now, having said that, there are some best sources of information from the IPCC that people probably aren't aware of. There's two of them, and they're very short and they're very definite. The first one is, in the past two assessments, they've been doing what they call headline statements. So they do three working group assessments, as you know. Number one, the science. Number two is the impacts. Number three is mitigation. So now they've got this very easy, super concise, most important points. The other thing, a source on the IPC, which is similarly easy to understand and really excellent, is the FAQs. Their frequently asked questions are really, really good. So, a person can really pick up what's important by just actually going through those frequently asked questions. Otherwise, there's so much climate science stuff, it's pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, and I guess another question I have with regards, say, for example, the Australian government. I mean, to your knowledge, not Australia per se, but are governments just taking this 5-yearly report and going, that's the gospel, and then just creating policy on the basis of that? Or are they actively keeping up to date with all of these streams of information? Because it seems like in Australia, we've got...
Australia doesn't put out an annual assessment. They put out a biennial assessment every 2 years. It has been backed by CSIRO, the Commonwealth Lab, and they do absolutely excellent work.
Yeah.
So I hope that hasn't been cut back, like the American have been cut back, but they should definitely be putting one out every single year.
Yeah.
I mean, the point here is that everything is changing so incredibly, terribly fast, right?
Yeah, and that's fundamentally the point that I'm getting to. If you've got a 5-yearly report that comes out and it takes maybe around 2 years for a scientist to come back from the field to write up his paper, to submit it, to go through the peer review process, then even if there's no 2-year waiting list, as you're suggesting, right, that you're basing your environmental climate policy on data, which can be at any time up to 7 years out of date, as we're in this sort of steep exponential rate of change phase. I mean, it just seems like we're flying blind. That's the concern that I've got. And the governments are always going to be trying to play down the risk because the government's primary role seems to be to maintain the status quo, not to bring about the changes necessary to prepare for a dangerous future.
Well, it's long been acknowledged that the IPCC gives what's called conservative assessments.
Yeah.
And actually every assessment has been somewhat worse on that. So the worse the reality gets, the sort of more the IPCC assessments, I believe, under the influence of the so-called policymakers, kind of draw back. And that's pretty bad right now. At this stage, it's pretty bad. They're holding back what the whole world needs to know. And I've just mentioned the immediate decline of global emissions as one example.
Mm, mm. Another question that I have was the work is for a very long time has been focused on the concept of this global average temperature. Okay, so the 2 degrees target or two degrees guardrail or whatever you call it is to do with this global average. But places are being affected by these climatic changes very differently around the world. So a 2-degree global average might mean the near annihilation of a particular part of the world because
Yeah.
its temperature changes are different.
They only use 2 degrees C as their metric, as their indicator. Don't use anything else. The group out of Leeds uses at least half a dozen, right? And that's what I've always done. You can't make any conclusion on one indicator. You have to have several. But the worst possible indicator is global warming. I mean, it's not just that the average person, let alone anybody who's interested, really can't understand what that is, right?
Yeah.
It gets worse than that. And it's not legitimate because the convention of 1992, which of course is still binding despite Paris, and all the governments are agreed on, did not make global warming the metric. And they made atmospheric greenhouse concentrations the metric. And that makes things very, very, very different. I mean, to begin with, that's not a hard thing to understand because there's a definite number. We know this year, it's not a big range, it's a definite number. So of course, not many people will realize that. And the scientists, I think they should have done better. They should not have stuck to this single metric because for years they've acknowledged that it's not really a good metric. They have suggested, for example, ocean heat content could be a metric, but it never happens. And I think, again, and this isn't an excuse for the scientists, it's a reality of what's going on. The policymakers on the panel can keep it out.
Mm. So what would be an optimal sort of metric? How, rather than this global average, I can see the value of greenhouse gas concentration measured in CO2e,
Yeah.
which I think is one of the
Well,
measures. in the planetary boundaries climate change boundary is concentration of CO2. I think there's two actually, and the other one is global average temperature, is it? But what are some of the other sort of metrics that you could use to actually measure the state of this problem?
Well, many years ago, there was a sort of international outfit called the International Biosphere Project. They've rolled into something else since, but they actually did it. They produced what they called a global climate change index, and that included global warming, sea ice, and the other thing, sea ice and sea level rise. So they had three metrics, which made a very big difference when they combined those metrics. So they dropped it, and I asked them to put it back, and they sort of put it back for a couple of years, but then I noticed it had gone again. Well, Guy, you only have to know atmospheric CO2 concentration. You actually don't have to know anything else at all,
Yeah,
because we've always known that that causes 2/3 of the heating. The IPCC says that actually it's probably now 80% of the heating. So you can say that atmospheric CO2, gives you an indicator of all the heating. And not only that, it gives you the ocean acidification.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's a huge one, tends to get, forgotten, missed
yeah,
out. So that's very good. The scientists are very keen, as James Hansen has been, like forever, on Earth energy imbalance. And that's pretty useful right now because that's accelerating. Everything, practically everything, Guy, is accelerating.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've been involved in this since 2002 when I was
Yeah.
working with a Commonwealth government program called the Greenhouse Challenge. That's when I first started reading on climate and looking at the IPCC reports. And I remember kind of looking at, I've still got some of the documents around that, and the narrative back then, this was 2002, so what's that, 24 years ago, was if we don't make change, we're going to have a big problem at the end of the century. That seemed to be the concern. And here we are, what, 24 years later, we're actually in the problem right now. The problem is somewhat early.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the science does do. And that's more than a huge problem of communication. It's extremely misleading,
Yeah,
because somebody reads, oh, there's going to be so much increase in drought by 2100. Well, that's not going to worry them. 2100 is forever away, for
yeah,
heaven's sake.
yeah.
So, and they don't say what it's going to be by 2050, for example. You
Mm,
don't have that actually documented and written down. All this stuff, as you probably have experienced, you have to work out for yourself.
mm. Yeah, and the other thing is that back in the good old days, with the SRES, the various models that were generated to try and project the forward temperatures and atmospheric
Mhm.
concentrations. And they had like these, what, four or five different pathways that like
Yeah,
RCP, representative
yeah.
concentration pathways. And I think 8.5 was the highest.
Yeah.
Now, my understanding, does that mean that does 8.5 mean that we were going to end up at 8.5 C above baseline?
Oh no, 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 no. They're radiative forcing.
Right. Okay.
So they're just radiative forcing numbers, but of course the scientists don't explain that, unfortunately. It's pretty
Yeah.
straightforward. So the 8.5 is 8.5 watts per square meter.
Okay. Right.
And that is a metric that
Yeah.
they ought to be using,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
because radiative forcing is the total heat. So
Yeah.
that's a great metric.
Yeah. That's the total heat. And the point that I was going to make as well was out of those like five, there was five standard of these models. We're always hitting the top end of the scale. every time you look at, well, it could get worse or it could get a bit better, it's always getting worse. And
Mhm.
um, so in a way, it's like, I mean, I attended one of the climate COPs. I really had to be at the climate COP that was run by an oil man. It just the irony of that, I just could not let go. So I got to Dubai and, and I'm sort of right in the middle of it all. And you just, and humanity has absolutely dropped the ball on this mission. Absolutely. We're
Oh, totally.
flying
Yeah.
blind
Yeah.
and we have absolutely dropped the ball. And because of this global machine, the superorganism, as a term I like from Nate Hagen's, the superorganism is just growing at around 3% per annum, which means it doubles in size every 25 years or so, predominantly fueled by inexpensive fossil fuels. I mean, we're just heading to this utter catastrophe. And in a way, sort of trying to step back and looking at these things from a broader geological time frame, the carbon pulse, again, another expression from Nate Hagen's and the great simplification that's coming. It just seems like an inevitable consequence of a species that wasn't able to that didn't have autopoiesis. That's my new favorite word. So autopoiesis being this innate capacity of a system to actually protect itself.
Okay.
Okay, came out of it's a term from I think evolutionary biology, and this is something, and again, this is where we sort of step into the Vita Sapien territory, is that our our global civilization does not have autopoiesis. It has not developed a self-preservation mechanism. There are individual parts of it will be trying to preserve their own turf by throwing missiles around the place, but there is no existing power structure on the planet that can actually manage the autopoiesis of human civilization, which ultimately means maintaining the integrity of the biosphere. And so at that sort of highest level, we've got the United Nations as this global body, and then you've got all of these nations in competition. And because the dominant energy supply, 80% of all the energy consumed comes from fossil fuels, this handful of giant corporations are effectively the main drivers of decision making on the planet, with the relationship between humans and the planet.
Yeah, and as Al Gore pointed out so graphically so many years ago, with his scales, it's always the gold that tips the scale, right? So there are some intrinsic reasons why what you say, of course, is absolutely right. Um, uh, One is that we're a very, very complex civilization, and complex civilizations, as bigger they get, the worse they tend to get at making decisions, and they always end up collapsing. So there's that. But in addition to that, science is actually part of the problem. Science isn't just a part of the problem because, they invent the atom bomb and they invent well, they invented fracking, for example, and then they put it out sort of objectively. This is just science. We're just putting it out there, and sort of don't give any warnings. But of course, what is well used to be well recognized is that our science is highly reductionist.
Mm.
So, in other words, the science itself reflects what you've just described, Guy, right? And the IPCC, I know, have tried to do something about this, but it's next to impossible because they are tasked with looking at every single published paper on climate change. So of course they have to split it up, right? And a person has to be really trained to be able to draw conclusions from the way the science is done and presented. It's not easy. There's actually a really, really interesting book. And this is right up your field. Did you ever read Carolyn Merchant? The Professor Carolyn Merchant, The Death of Nature, which I
Okay.
think she wrote in '88, Berkeley, California. And um, that used to be the best book I've ever read, but your much smaller book now, I think, is the best book that I've ever read.
The best book.
But she's an environmental historian, and it's a must read for you. You'd lap it up.
Okay.
And she explains that no, it's not actually the religions and Christianity and that brought us down. It was actually the scientific revolution that changed the way we think, fundamentally changed the way we think.
Yeah. Yeah. And in a way, I mean, science is ultimately um, going back into Vita Sapien philosophy, this concept of the cognitive revolution around 70,000 years ago, where the Homo sapiens, through various means, developed these greater cognitive abilities, including this sort of inquiry. And, the cognitive revolution was really the beginning of science in a way, because you have a greater cognition and these questions come up and you seek answers to the questions. And so we're seeking answers to the questions, these big physics questions about how much carbon is too much in the atmosphere and how much temperatures does that lead to. And as you point out, it's that reductionist aspect of science that cripples its ability to actually see the whole. And so I guess the question is, what is the name of the wisdom? What is the name of the process to acquire wisdom that allows you to see the whole? Because it's not science.
No, it's not science. No, no, and science and the IPCC stresses this to an extent that they really don't need to. So the IPCC terms of reference say that the IPCC scientists can't make value judgments, for example. Well, that's absolutely ridiculous. Scientists have always made value judgments, including the modelers. But the thing that really hamstrings the IPCC most is that they have this rule, quote, that they're not allowed to publish anything which is policy prescriptive. They're only able to publish things that are policy relevant, right? So they're not allowed to say, well, we're heading towards biosphere collapse, which is what I mostly presented to at the big scientific conferences. If you combine the indicators all together, so the indicators separately, they're reductionist, with the exception that atmospheric CO2 is great, ocean heat is great, and radiative forcing is great. So any one of those, right?
Mm.
But no, they give us global warming. So that's the answer to that. That can be done.
Yeah. Okay. Um, yeah. And look, the death, and this is the way I frame it. The death of nature, nice expression. The way that I frame it, using the reference in the philosophy to Gaia, Gaia as in GAIA, the scientific theory, or GYA, the spiritual belief, the idea that the biosphere has characteristics of, or indeed actually is, a single living being. And when you think of the world in that regard, and think of life on Earth as being a single living being, you can start to sort of see that things like the great forests, the phytoplankton in the ocean, and so forth, are actually like organs within the greater body. And then when you view these, like I'll give you an example. I was reading recently about the biotic pump.
Oh yeah. Mm.
Yeah, which is this just mind blowing, actually. I really,
Rather important.
yeah. So the idea that these vast tracts of forest are actually effectively like a air conditioning system dumping excess heat into the upper atmosphere so that most of it escapes. that if you keep hammering away at the organs, like in a human
Yeah,
body, you've got what, 10 organs or something, that if any one of those organs fails, then if you don't have a kidney, it's not like your heart can beat faster. If you don't have kidneys, then the kidney function is integral to the living body, and then the body dies. So if we kill off any one single organ, that will potentially just collapse the whole system in on itself.
that's
Um,
absolutely right. And of course, that pretty well reflects the indigenous worldview. And before the organized religions, the animistic worldview, that pretty well reflects those. But we fundamentally, by not accepting the fact, and science, by the way, has proven, right? It's proven that the Earth is alive, you know, no question about it. But science will not allow us to look at it like that because sort of we never have. But so long as I mean, the indigenous people, I have great First Nations friends in Canada, and like they've always known, and they still say as often as they can, that Mother Earth is what really, really matters beyond anything else. Now, I've learned being a Brit, right, that if you're brought up generation after generation to rationally believe that Earth is a being, a living being, not only that, the mother of all other living beings, has been termed the Great Mother by some anthropologists. Um, and you don't consider that, well, you can't really make sense of anything at all. I think it's not just perverse that we exclude that. It's not just irrational that we exclude that. Fundamentally, I think it's insane. If you have a belief or approach, a science, a religion, a spirituality that isn't centered on the living being of Mother Earth, it's not going to work. It's not
yeah,
going to work because
yeah,
you have no guide, right? You have no center.
yeah. No, that's exactly right. And this comes back to that beautiful word that I love so much, autopoiesis. And to use Christianity as the frame of reference, given that it's the dominant spiritual philosophy in the Western world where we are from. Obviously, there's other religions and other people, but I focus on Christianity because that's the part of the world that I come from, is that there is zero autopoiesis in the narrative, Christian narrative. And in fact, I mean, this business, this war in Iran, um, you know, Pete Hegseth and the people advising Donald Trump are motivated by biblical end time myths. So when the war started, what, 40 days ago,
Really? Oh,
there was a charity that was established in the US that provided services for the spiritual needs of American warfighters. Okay. And they were getting inundated with complaints from the field that military commanders were telling their troops that this was the holy war that was going to bring back Jesus Christ. This was basically the Armageddon war that had been prophesied in the Bible. That became very abundant, and indeed even Hegseth, if you actually take his underneath his clothes, he's covered in Crusader tattoos. So what we've got here is the dominant paradigm, the dominant spiritual paradigm in the West. A large proportion of those people believe that the earth wasn't meant to be around for much longer because Jesus was going to come back and that was going to precipitate this global war that ruined everything. And also the other thing, and I made a video about this just recently called Armageddon Cancelled. I'll put the link in the YouTube, to really just sort of zoom in on this point. And the other thing was, I was stuck behind a bus recently and it had a symbol, a Christian symbol on it. which was the dove with the fig leaf or whatever it is. And I'm sitting
Okay.
there in the car just waiting for this bus to move off, and I'm thinking, what's that story? That's right, it's about Noah's Ark, and in the
No.
story of
Yeah.
Noah's Ark,
Yeah.
God gets angry because of the wicked people, so he floods
Yeah.
something. And I'm thinking to myself, like, I get it. You flood the wicked people. I kind of, I don't agree with that, but you can sort of see the logic. But why would you flood the wildlife? And I did some sums, and there's like, around 3,000 years ago, there would have been something like 10 million elephants on the earth. Well,
No.
two
Yeah.
survived in that story. Now, obviously, the flood didn't happen, but it's an allegorical story, granted. But what a perverse allegorical story. And so,
Well, yeah.
I guess what I'm getting to is that at the very heart of Western civilization that invented the Industrial Revolution, let's not forget it was Christians that created the steam engines, right? Is we've got this spiritual philosophy that has got zero regard for the integrity of the biosphere. That is our life support system. It's a spiritual philosophy that has zero autopoiesis. And so of course the work that I've been doing is to say, well, okay, let's have a better spiritual philosophy, one that's got autopoiesis into it. The question then is, how do you spread that to millions of people so that it actually has effect? Because right now it's a book, it's a website, it's a few YouTube videos, handful of people know about it. So the question is, how do you actually spread the new spiritual philosophy so it can actually give effect?
Well, your book, as a whole, and in part, in many cases, provides the solution to what people are increasingly, very obviously realizing is that we're headed to what I call global suicide.
Yeah.
If you look at all the indicators, everything record high, everything accelerating faster and faster. I mean, we have all the scientists now agreeing with James Hansen that global warming is accelerating, right? The first YouTube I did on that, as I think I mentioned, was 7 years ago. Um, uh, the scientists are very reluctant, as I say, to sort of sort of put the terrible truth out there. So there's no solution in science. And that's
Yeah.
why everybody's going to look, right? It's natural. They're taught to look at science, right? And they the question comes out of spirituality and ethics and morality. That's where the solutions come out of.
Yeah.
And your book, it's quite amazing because it's a small book, and it's amazing how you lay it out in the different stages. It's very clear, Guy. Your book is so clear,
Mm.
you know. So, whereas only 1% of people might be able to read the IPCC assessment, I think your book is readily understandable by anyone.
Um, so the theory behind the philosophy was that the theory is that there is around 8% of Western adults would be would adopt this, not this per se, but something like this as a spiritual philosophy if it were put to them in a compelling manner. That's the theory, and that's around 50 million people. And if 50 million people got their head and their heart around the concept of the verdant age, of course, being the potential future time where we resolve the Anthropocene
Yeah.
crisis, right? And then we regrow the forests, and then we get to live on a planet where we don't have the existential like risk of ecosystem collapse. Um, as a sort of a spiritual quest to be a part of creating the verdant age. The number could be 4%, it could be 16%. I don't know, but I think 8% is a nice round number. I came up with that number when I was thinking about this in the very beginning when we registered the charity. We were asked this question as to how many followers there could be, and that's the number I came up with. And I got that
Right.
number
Yeah.
from a model called cultural creatives. So there was a book came out in 2000 saying that there were, if you look at the way that Western people think, there were these three basic tropes. Half of the people think in the term they call moderns, where they don't really see that there's a problem in the world. But then about 35% of the public think as cultural creatives, and cultural creatives empathize with the environment, with Indigenous people, women, children, trans and gay, and they're kind of connected like lefties basically. And so my theory was that a quarter of the cultural creatives would adopt Vita Sapien philosophy or a philosophy like it, a philosophy like this, which just creates an alternative worldview to that of Christianity and New Age spirituality, which is itself distracting from
Yeah,
science and reality.
that did not come out to be much of a great success, did it?
No. I'm working on. That's right. I was at this. We hosted a moon party recently, and we were talking about these things called Vita monikers. A moniker is like a four-word name, like a sort of a totem animal in indigenous cultures. The idea of a Vitan moniker is that, give us an example of how you personally identify with the biosphere. So my moniker is long gone ocean fish, because I've worked in commercial fisheries, and you got this real sense that the big fish are gone, but the smaller ones are left, and there's this ancient, history goes back billions of years, and all these creatures that lived in the ocean that are no longer with us, long gone ocean fish. And one of the people in the group mentioned cosmos, and I'm like, oh man, it's just something. Cosmos is this new age spiritual idea. So I'm doing a YouTube on it. I'm just working on the script, but I did some sort of homework on where the idea of cosmic came from in the new age narrative. And it goes back to this woman called Helena Blavatsky, from this group called the Theosophical Society.
Oh, philosophical. They've been going for at least a couple of hundred years.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And they were that was she was probably mostly responsible. Obviously, there's lots of other people involved for what is now called the New Age spiritual movement. And I came across that work some years before, because I keep these little well, they're called blue obsidian crystals. And I'm like, I bought these things for like $2 each, and you put them in your hand and you rub them together, and they make this squeaky noise. They're beautiful. They're also called aqua lemuria. And I'm like starting to do some homework on these aqua lemuria, because blue obsidian crystals suggest that they're blue, whether or not they're aquamarine. It suggests that they're obsidian, which means volcanic glass, which they're not. Turns out they're actually just bottle glass. And crystals, but they're not actually crystals, because glass is amorphous. So I started getting very questioning about some of the supposed truths coming out of the crystal shops. And so I started to read up on this whole idea of Lemuria, which is something that Blavatsky brought into the world. She didn't bring it into the world. She popularized it as this ancient lost continent. But if you actually go back to the origination of the word Lemuria, it was a British biologist who was trying to figure out why there were lemurs on Madagascar and in India, but none in Africa, which is right next door to Madagascar. And he hypothesized that there was an ancient continent that connected Madagascar to India that had subsequently subsided into the ocean. So here it was just a hypothesis to explain this lemur mystery. Turned out there wasn't a mystery, because there are no lemurs in India. It's a different genus of creature. So Blavatsky took the idea of this continent that had sunk below the sea and started to tell all of these stories about the people that lived on it, and the crystals and the volcanoes. And that's where this whole idea of the blue obsidian, the aqua lemuria, that's the name of these little stones, which are not stones. They're bottle glass sold for $4 at crystal shops and given all of these spiritual meanings. So for me, Christianity, I mean, it's got no autopoiesis, and a big chunk of the people that believe it actually believe it tells us that we ought to facilitate the annihilation of the biosphere. And New Age spirituality is just so full of nonsense that
Well, spirituality,
those,
sorry, but Christianity, like the other so-called major religions, right? They're based on a book,
yeah,
and indigenous culture. And we have been an indigenous animistic culture for 99.9999 time,
yeah,
duration
yeah,
of the human species. Apparently, the latest archaeology and says we go back 2 million years, right?
yeah,
So, but that sort of brings to the question of, well, who we are.
yeah,
And we have not answered that question, and that's a big problem for people because that makes them vulnerable to all kinds of suggestions,
yeah,
pretty bad suggestions about who we are and what we are. So we need to get that one solved. I mean, I've been a medical doctor, family practice and lots of emergency medicine for a lifetime. And I really object to when I read climate change and particularly, but this is all humanity's fault, right? Humanity is hardwired to do this. This is a problem from humanity, right? No, God, it's not. Number one, like I know human beings and they're great, but I know them individually. So that sort of makes a difference. But they're pretty well 100% beautiful people, you know?
mm,
Uh, uh, but of course, the other thing is that we have been successful so well because of our wonderful cooperative nature, but that also allows us to band together, and here we are with not just one other terrible war, but several other terrible wars going on. And I want to say that because like you, I've always been very interested in this guy. I've been very, very interested in comparative religion and, because it's seeking, who I am, who we are. And so when I took a look at the Bible, for some reason years ago, I decided, well, I should read this book. So I said, I'll read it. I'll set myself this task. I'll read it from cover to cover. Oh my God, wow. The Old Testament guy is not a happy read. It is not a
no,
happy read at all.
yeah,
And so you plow your way through the Old Testament, and then you come to a short little, it's called a book, but it's a poem, and it's called a Song of Songs. And it's one of the most beautiful erotic, poems describing the beauty of other animals and the natural world, and all confluent together like poetry can. And I thought, wow, how did they get this into the Bible?
yeah, right,
This is awesome. This is wonderful.
yeah,
But then I read, but the other one that they squeezed in was this book called the Book of Revelation,
yeah,
which is what you're referring to.
yeah,
And it's what we call the Christian fundamentalists it's what their religion is, right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
it's absolutely not Christianity. Totally, totally not. The book doesn't even pretend to be Christianity. It
yeah,
doesn't actually pretend to be a religion.
yeah, yeah.
But it's a problem. It's a huge that book is a huge, huge problem.
I've actually been doing some homework on this recently, research to go into some forthcoming YouTubes, and I was reading up on the Nicene Council, and this is basically see the way I see it, okay, is that the Christian faith has got two primary foundations, one of which is ancient Hebrewic religions that date back to around 3,000 years. And these guys were searching for answers, right? And they were ignorant in as much as they didn't have the Hubble Space Telescope information or the science of paleoanthropology or the double helix
Yeah.
DNA. Okay. But nonetheless, as inquiring humans do, because of the cognitive revolution, created the capacity to ask questions that there was no immediate answer for. So back in these 3,000 years ago or whenever, people were trying to puzzle out where it all came from. And the logical sort of thought was, well, in a tribe, there is a big, strong man. So maybe there was a big, strong man that made everything. So you can see how that was logical. And they're trying to puzzle it out. And then along came Plato. And Plato had been thinking about all these things himself. And he had these really interesting models around spiritual realm versus, the material world, that there was these two different realms.
Yeah.
That there was this concept called forms, that, for example, there is a concept called like a circle can be described mathematically in perfection, but you cannot find anybody that can actually make a perfect circle. So that there was this sort of idea of this perfection lived outside in this other spiritual realm. And so what happened was these ancient Hebrews went, wow, this guy's nailed it. So they grabbed ancient Hebrew monotheistic thinking, plugged in the Platonic thinking, and then sometime around, I think about 300 AD, they had this thing called the Nicene Council under Constantinople, the Emperor of Rome, who brought all these thinkers together, and they hashed out what was in and what was out, and where did this guy Jesus fit into this narrative, right? Now remember, the Romans
Yeah,
had
that's where the book of Revelations got put into the Bible.
right.
And I gather against a lot of opposition from the bishops who
Right.
didn't like it. But somehow it made it in the Bible, but it has no place in the Christian Bible whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's completely extraordinary. Um, uh,
And the other thing is so I started to think of, well, let's strip away all of this stuff and let's just get back down to this Jesus character. Don't ask a Christian about Jesus, ask a historian. So if you ask the historians, they'll tell you, yeah, there was this guy around about that time, probably born 4 years after he was supposed to be born, but whatever. And he was popular. He was like left-leaning, radical, running interference on the religious authorities, running interference on the Roman occupation. And eventually he got so powerful, popular and powerful, that they decided to get rid of him. And they gave him a very standard death. There was nothing extraordinary about the crucifixion of Christ. There was
yeah,
thousands of people got crucified. Now he got the nails rather than the ropes, but that was typical for people that were sort of more, if you're a low level crime crucifixion, they'd rope you up. If you're a higher level crime crucifixion, they'd spend the money to give you the nails. Absolutely nothing absolutely nothing spectacular about that, right? And here's the thing as well. Okay, so he spent a lot of time in the wilderness, right? So I think Jesus was a vegan. And so in the definition of the Vetan is somebody who loves nature, somebody who's grounded in reality, and somebody who's taking action. So in a way, Jesus, the man, Jesus of Nazareth, right, was an early kind of Vetan. He's got Buddhist tendencies. He's caring for people. He's a loving, kind guy. And so then what happened? They took this guy that was running interference on the cruelty and the power concentration of the religious authorities and the Romans, nailed him up, killed him, he died, he's finished. And then later on, 300 years later, they're going, you know what, that guy is actually pretty instrumental. If we bring him in as the Son of God, and then there was this big argument as to whether he was the Son of God or whether he actually was God. And that, I think, the argument continues to this day. So the Bible is kind of like, it's what I call sausage factory. It's like everybody loves the product, but you would not want to go and see how they make the sausage. And the more I look into how this document that persists today was fabricated, you realize just how disconnected it is from anything grounded in spirituality and, right thinking for a living organism that's dependent on phytoplankton and forests to produce its oxygen.
Yeah, I, I've got to say, like I was immersed in Christianity in England and my family and everything. Um, uh, and I was very happy to learn that from the Jewish people. I don't call people Jews, Christians, or Muslims, by the way, like the rest of the world does. I call them Jewish people, Christian people, because first of all, we're people, we're human
Sure.
beings. So I was quite happy to hear that the Jewish people regarded Jesus with a lot of respect as a Reform rabbi. Now that's interesting. Because when you get to read the four Gospels, which is quite short, I mean, you got this huge book called the Bible, right? So then you got the New Testament, which actually I think the Gideon Bible, which is used to be put in hotels and motels, I think that's just the four Gospels.
Okay.
And I think one of my heroes, Thomas Berry, sort of says something like, well, you can take the four Gospels and throw the rest away, something like that. But when you've plowed your way through the entire Bible and you come to the Gospels, it's an absolute breath of fresh air. I mean, you're right. I mean, they're wonderful stories. They're stories of essentially human goodness, understanding, compassion, of course. Um, not the standard version of Christianity that we're sort of exposed to far too often. And we know that the early Christians were vegetarians at least, because one of the early leading bishops wrote to the churches complaining that too many of them were starting to eat meat. So that's interesting. Yeah, you mentioned that. So that's very interesting. Now, here's the other thing. Emperor Constantine made Christianity a state religion, and my God, it's gone. It's not been a happy story ever since then. But
Mm,
the one thing we know about the Christians is that they were
mm,
profound pacifists,
mm,
which is why they got fed to the lions, right? And not necessarily the reason why Jesus was crucified. I mean, he was opposing not only the rule of the Roman Empire, we know that because of a couple of things he said, and but he was really, really messing about with the strict beliefs in what was the Jewish religion at that time, right? And if you're following a religion of the book, which is all written down, you don't get away with doing that.
mm. Yeah. Okay, good stuff. So okay, so we've got something in the order of 2.4 billion Christians and
Yeah.
potentially 53 million Vitans. And in the little book, so there's a little section here I just want to refer to and get your thoughts on it. So uh, um, it's called the Vita Transition Plan. So the idea is that if there were to be 53 million people who were spiritually motivated to protect the planet, and this is really important stuff. The distinction being that I think that most environmentalists, and I spend most of my time around people that would fall under that banner, and I've been involved in the Extinction Rebellion movement. I was in London for that big event in 2019,
Were
which
you really? Oh my gosh. Good
yeah,
for
yeah, I
you.
went I went over there. I'd actually I'd had a little stint doing in-home solar sales and I
Yeah.
made some money and that was going on, so I got to go over there. That
Oh,
was insane. That was the October 2019 event. There were thousands and thousands of people running interference. The model that they were following was that if you can get enough people to gridlock the capital for 2 weeks,
yeah.
the history showed that governments tend to collapse down into negotiation mode. And
Yes.
that was what they were trying to do, but they didn't have enough people. They had maybe 10,000 core and about another 20,000 turned up on the Saturday for big street protests. They
Oh,
simply didn't have enough
okay.
people to gridlock the capital. But everyone that the core that turned up were there for 2 weeks. They turned up for 2 weeks. That was the whole point. It was to stay there.
Right.
But they just got like there was 1,200 people arrested, and it failed. Didn't get enough people, and partly because people weren't feeling the pain of climate change yet. So who knows, it might come. So the idea is if there are 50, now that's the point I was trying to make as well, is that most of the environmentalists are many of them are probably spiritually motivated, but they wouldn't use that language, I don't
Right.
think.
Right.
Because most of, say, for example, the British Extinction Rebellion activists would actually have been Christian. And so to actually say to them, look, you're actually motivated spiritually, protect the planet, they're more likely to go, oh, no, 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 I'm doing this because of rational reasons. And fundamental point that I make in Vita Sapien philosophy is that rational reasons do not motivate you to do much, right? However, spiritual motivation makes you climb to the top of the mountain, go the extra mile, whatever it is. You want to get the best bang for the buck out of a human being, they got to be motivated spiritually. And a part of my coming to that understanding is reading the work of this researcher called Scott Atran, who was involved in sociological research on the battleground between the Kurds and the ISIS fighters. And he
Oh,
was talking to these Kurdish fighters who were getting absolutely hammered with IEDs and rocket launchers and heavy machine guns and these brutal, brutal house-to-house battles with ISIS. And when he talked to the Kurds, he says, "What's motivating you?" And they says, "Kurdeity." Right? It's the spiritual belief that the Kurds live in these mountains. That's it. And when you motivate somebody spiritually, you got yourself a fighter. And this, I think, is fundamentally missing from the environmental movement, is that it isn't a spiritual movement, it's a rational movement. And we're only getting about one tenth of the potential effort out of the individual environmental activist. So that's the idea of Vita Sapien, is to try and bring a spiritual motivation to environmental activism. And then once we've got this army of spiritually empowered people protecting Gaia and advancing the verdant age, the question is, what game are they engaged in, which is this idea of the transition plan. So I just wanted to run this past you and get your thoughts, right? Um, so there's 5 parts written down. So climate reset, which is about transitioning
yeah.
away from fossil
Remember that.
fuels
Yeah.
and drawing down a trillion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere as the number one. Wild revival, which is to nurture endangered species back to stable populations and rewild a third or more of the planet to restore biosphere integrity. Planet detox, which is to transform the waste left behind from 250 years of industrial civilization, including landfills, marine plastics, chemical and nuclear waste. Circular future, which is to create a fair and efficient, ecologically sustainable global socioeconomic system so that all humans can thrive. And then nature first, which is to foster the spiritual and intellectual bond to nature in all cultures to ensure that we don't end up at the brink of the abyss again. So that's the 5 points of the transition plan. Is there anything in there that you would add or change?
Not really. I remember reading it, and I mean, it's a great formula, right? And people also need shorthand, right?
Mm.
You know, they can read all kinds of great philosophy and great religious works, but they need something that is bang 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 bang, right? And that's
Yeah,
reasonable, right?
bullet
That's reasonable.
points.
So, but the other thing that struck me about it is that um, they are good actions. And that reminded me of Buddhism, of course, because Buddhism is it's a different religion, it's you can't really classify it under the other, sort of three great religions, so-called. And the Buddhist appeal was this is the way to happiness, right? This is the way to nirvana. This is the way to bliss.
Yeah.
And so um, the you have the socioeconomic transformation, and certainly, and this has been recognized for many, many, many years. We continue on the path to our own destruction and the destruction of most other life on Earth. That's what we're looking at, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah.
The science is absolutely definite, right?
Yeah.
If all of these, what I call indicators, but they're actually planet degraders, if all of these continue to accelerate, right? It's not a question of, will we survive? It's a
Yeah.
bigger question than that.
Yeah, yeah, we're going to take down most life on Earth,
Yeah.
and quite possibly back to this point about the organs, that if we destroy enough of the biosphere, the planet will lose its homeostasis for some period,
Yeah.
right? And could end up with temperatures that just bleach us all the way back to the Cambrian.
Well, oh yeah, the Cambrian explosion. Yeah. If not, if not worse, in fact. Um,
Mm,
uh, People, particularly climate change experts and people, resist fear. Fear is a strong motivator. But with climate change, we've entered this extraordinary human situation where we've even thrown away our survival instinct, right?
yeah,
Everybody involved in climate change has come to an agreement that you can't make climate change scary. It's
yeah,
absolutely absurd,
yeah, yeah,
completely absurd,
yeah,
but it
yeah.
still prevails. It still prevails. So, the religious people would say, well, you have two motivators, you have fear and you have love, and we certainly need yours. But your book comes across as a very loving book. Your book comes across as a very caring book, So people really just have to read the book, and they're going to get that aspect out of it. In this day and age, and I certainly know, the trying to get supporters and advocates, for a philosophical spirituality, your mission, right, is it's more than a hard sell now because everybody is stuck to a screen, right? Everybody's stuck to a screen. It's not just that people don't sort of appreciate the natural world. They don't live in the natural world anymore. It doesn't exist for them.
Mm,
The only thing that exists for people is something invented by science and technology,
mm.
um, um, which is, I mean, the influence is absolutely horrendous, right? But that brings us back actually to the big influence over our society of economics, right? And our economics specifically excludes anything about nature,
Yeah,
specifically excludes it as well,
yeah,
It's given the fancy word of externalization, but it specifically excludes all future generations as well.
yeah,
Well, to my mind, that's not only irrational, frankly, that's evil,
yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean, if you look at the natural world and I say, we're going to exclude this, we're going to ignore it, we're not even going to ever think about it. I think that's a road to evil if it's not evil of itself.
yeah. So just 2 points. So on evil, and I just want to step back to this point about not giving out the bad news. So we've had conversations about evil before, but
Oh,
since
you're
the
right.
last
Yes.
one, since that last one, I actually went back to the origins of the word, and it goes back to Middle English, and it was previously spelled EFYL, so it's Ephel, right? And so the origination of evil is Ephel, which meant um, doing something to excess that leads to a negative outcome.
Okay.
That's the
Okay.
origination of the word, yeah. So just on that other point about how, broadly speaking, when people talk about climate change, they don't talk about how bad it is and how
No, they
bad
don't.
it's going to get. So I've struggled with that a lot, but I found a framework which is now written in the book, which actually really helps to resolve that. And it's called the Stockdale paradox.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That was brilliant.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. Oh, is that why you put it in? Oh my God, good for you
No,
guys.
well, specifically, so just to recap the story, then Commander Stockdale was an American airman that was shot down over Vietnam and was held in captivity as a POW for 6 years and was the most senior of the American captives. And he suffered terribly with beatings and torture and starvation and mistreatment and blah 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 blah. So, but he survived, and he recounted his story one time, and he said, "Look," he said the pessimists, he says they perish.
Yeah.
The pessimists die very
Yeah.
quickly. He said, but the optimists, he says, they're hot on their heels. He says, what you need to get through this is you've got to have two things. You got to have a steely-eyed clarity about just how royally screwed you are. You've got to understand how bad it is, right? You've got to
Yeah.
accept it.
Yeah.
And secondly, you just got to maintain the faith that you're going to prevail irrespective. And
Yeah.
those,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so for
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. I remember that. Yeah.
absolutely at the heart of the Vita Sapien way of dealing with climate communication is to let people know just how bad it is, but say somewhere in the human spirit, there is a pathway through this. I personally don't know what it is myself, haven't found it, been looking for 22 years. Um, but something to do with a social movement that has definitely necessarily has to be a spiritual movement in order to get that massive bang for the buck out of the small number of people that you'd be able to recruit into it. So that seems to me the only pathway. I mean, there is another kind of pathway that the fossil fuel industry has really overstepped its mark with this war, and it's facilitating the transition to clean energy because everyone's sick of high, the volatility of fuel prices. But that's a slow crawl. I mean, the fossil fuel industry is finished anyway because it's eventually going to run out of oil and gas. But we need to speed that transition up, right? And then the only way that I can see we can do that is through a mass movement that has a spiritual component. Um, yeah, there you go.
Yeah. It also, listening to you, I realize it also has to have a component of something which is part of Christianity, not part of all Christianity, but that's compassion. That's Mother Teresa's big thing.
Yeah.
So compassion can be a mighty motivator, right? If you're a mother or a father, and your child is being abused, you're gonna put your life on the line, to save that child. But on climate change in our civilization, we've gone the opposite way, right? We've just ignored it. So we desperately need compassion, in my view.
I just want to define that. So I've just done a quick Google on it. So compassion is a deep awareness of another's suffering coupled with the desire and action to alleviate it. Is that how you're using the term?
Yeah, yeah. In it can be an ongoing thing. It can be an instantaneous thing, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's walking along the seashore and sees somebody they don't know who's drowning, and they immediately
Yeah.
dive in and try and
Yeah.
save them. Very often they lose their life themselves.
Yeah.
Um, uh, yeah. I have to say, despite the criticism, I have to say Mother Teresa is probably one of the best examples. I mean, her life was absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And she was transformed, by the way, by one sentence from the New Testament. So,
Okay.
which she realized was compassion.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful little piece of the New Testament.
Um,
And
so the word compassion, so the word that comes to my mind is empathy, but are you suggesting that
yeah,
compassion suggests empathy plus action?
oh yeah, yeah.
So,
Empathy is good. Empathy is nice.
so,
Um,
so,
uh,
so compassion is like a verb. It's a doing word in a
yeah,
way.
it's an action thing. I mean, Mother Teresa repeatedly said, you talk about love, and while I'm a great example of love and everything, she said, you got to understand, little lady, there's only one kind of love, and that's love in action. She
Yeah.
says there is no other love.
Yeah.
So that's a great lesson. Um, uh,
Yeah.
um, my great partner, Julie here, she's written a lot about compassion. So writing about compassion actually is a very, very good thing.
Mm,
Giving stories of compassion, true stories.
mm,
That's a great thing.
mm,
I think it can certainly be mind altering.
mm. Yeah. And the compassion that I see is the compassion for future human generations
Yeah,
who whether there are still going to be people born into this world probably 100 years from now. I kind of tried to model the the extinction of humans. We're very tough, so it's going to be a while before the conditions on the planet are so bad that there are no more humans. I think it's certainly possible within a few centuries. Maybe, well, if we have a general exchange of nuclear weapons, it could happen very quickly. Actually, it could happen within probably a few years. But leaving aside general exchange of nuclear weapons, just the heating and the collapse of ecosystems and the spread of tropical diseases and the collapse of food production and the famine, like we're still going to be having people being born into this world who are going to be born into a world which is um, just hard in so many ways. I mean, I was born in 1967 and, probably one of the last sort of generations where you get to grow up through most of your life with prosperity and growth and
yeah,
and
yeah.
and now the future for everybody that comes into the world is just going to be I mean, there's still going to be beauty and wonder and opportunity for people to have great lives, but for most people, it's just going to be hellish.
Yeah, it is literally, and that's what I've been saying for some years.
Yeah,
By following the ridiculous world economics and we are allowing the fossil fuel industry to rule the roost, rule over us, rule over the world.
yeah,
By allowing the fossil fuel industry to do that, we leaving a life which can only be in my world anyway. It can only be described as a hellish life.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, okay. And then, of course, if there is some sort of movement, or ultimately it has to be a movement, I find it very hard to believe that there could be a technology or a suite of technologies that can show up. I mean, the clean tech is going to replace the need for fossil fuels across the board eventually. But of course, clean tech comes with its own problems, right? So,
Mhm.
the siting, the vast amounts of steel, fiberglass, and copper
Yes.
that are involved in building wind turbines have to come from somewhere. So, and if there were a global agreement all of a sudden that the fossil fuel industries committed to transitioning to becoming clean energy suppliers rather than oil, coal, and gas suppliers, and the world's militaries came in and said, well, we're going to enforce that and make sure nobody gets in the way of that. If there hypothetically were that wake up in the morning, I should give a name to that. That's a beautiful idea. Imagine that somebody clicked their fingers and all of a sudden everybody got on board the Vita transition plan or some sort of,
Yeah.
transition plan. Then we could very quickly start to wind back on some of the environmental harm that we are doing now, but in so doing, actually increase other types of environmental harm because the environmental footprint of solar PV and wind farms is a different type of environmental footprint to a coal mine and a coal-fired power station. And
Mhm.
so we've got to very carefully manage the rollout of the clean technology. And
Oh,
this
yeah.
is the term
Yeah.
that I use is sustainable clean energy to make the distinction between the unsustainable clean energy, because there's plenty of that around as well.
Well, I mean, the Chinese leadership that are far and away the biggest greenhouse gas polluters, of course, and they're still building power plants, probably because of AI. But their philosophy on this has been that we're going to develop clean energy as fast as it can possibly develop so that it reaches the stage when it can replace fossil fuel energy, right? Which seemed some years ago to be a very rational way of looking at it.
Mm.
But we don't have that. We don't have that time. Everything has to be now,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. Um, Yeah, and you can understand that logic that, we can see the problems of climate. We're going to start moving that direction. We're going to roll out the renewables. But of course, in the last 20 years, the vast rollout of renewables, and we're talking about solar farms that spread
Yeah,
across vast
amazing.
tracts, across
Yeah.
a third of Australian homes have got PV, um, wind farms that extend as far as the eye can see. All of that build out has only just managed to keep up with the growth in new demand because we've got a global economy that grows at 3% per annum.
That's right.
And
That's
so we
right.
haven't even, all of that build out hasn't even started to address the big 80% chunk in the middle, which is presently dominated by fossil fuels. And so when you sort of model that in your head, you start to see that the only way really out of it seems to be some sort of a global collapse in human population numbers that strips away the demand for energy to such an extent that the renewables that we've already built actually provides it. And I tell you, this Strait of Hormuz being closed, apart from the oil, it's shut down the urea, the nitrogen
Oh
fertilizer.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I
yeah,
think
yeah.
I think we could be on the verge of a massive, massive global famine within the next 6 to 9 months because of that alone.
Yeah, people, of course, most people have no idea how completely dependent our incredible agriculture is, on chemicals, urea produced from
Yes.
methane
Yeah.
and pesticides and herbicides,
And
The
diesel.
amount of food that the United States can put out is absolutely astounding.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, diesel fuel, diesel to run the tractors,
Yeah,
to run the trucks. I
and,
mean,
and a lot.
you might have the most beautiful bumper crops, but if you don't have enough diesel, you can't harvest it, you can't process it, you can't ship
Yeah,
it. Uh,
yeah,
anyway, so yeah, I think I like to sort of view things through the lens of Mother Gaia, and Gaia's looking down at this business in the Straits, and she's going, "Oh, there's a lot of air pollution from all this burning stuff. That's not good." But hey, this is going to slow down the growth of the superorganism. This is not a bad thing. So, I mean, that's the kind of there's that. Yeah, I mean, Mother Nature is not is in some instances warm and cuddly, but in other instances has got this bad habit of annihilating species, right? So 99% of every living creature every type of creature that's ever lived is now long gone. And so there is this harsh, cruel reality of Gaia, of the living planet. It self-corrects and it will terminate, you know, the miscreant species.
I don't know. I think James Lovelock and Margulis, the first great book that they wrote, in which Lovelock was persuaded to use the name Gaia. So that was good. That had huge influence. Do you remember? I
Yeah, well,
mean, massive influence.
I always refer back to the paper, the atmospheric
Yeah.
homeostasis by and for the biosphere, the Gaia hypothesis.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
But then somebody pointed out that Lovelock had been involved with the nuclear industry, so he got dropped dropped by the green crowd like a hot potato. But he was an
yeah.
awesome man. He was a great man.
He was
Um,
really skeptical of land-based wind farms. That was one of the things that really ticked him off. He was a guy that walked like 3 hours a day. Partly that's how he got to live to 103 years old. He used to walk out in the countrysides all the time. And he was horrified at the idea of fiberglass blades rotating and was a big advocate of, as you're saying, of nuclear. And there was, basically saying that done properly, it's got a very, very small waste footprint compared to like the 50 gigatons of waste that's punched out of fossil fuel generators and all the mercury and nitrous oxides and all the rest of it. I can see the argument. The way I saw it was that nuclear has got the same fundamental problem as fossil fuels, is that it leaves the waste to future generations to clean up.
well, fossil fuels is putting out its polluting weights every second of every day, right?
Mm.
Constantly, right? And it's not just greenhouse gas pollution. I mean, we've been aware of fossil fuel toxic air pollution for 150 years or more,
Yeah,
and it's a killer.
yeah.
The number that most people quote is that it kills 8 million people a year. But the most recent paper on it, although it's just a few years old, it's 10 million a year, right? So how can we tolerate that? How
Well,
can we tolerate an industry and a product, right, which is killing 10 million people a year? So many years ago, I tried to label the fossil fuel industry as the industry that kills today and kills forever because of
mm.
greenhouse gas pollution, right, builds
Yeah,
up
yeah,
cumulative, it kills forever.
yeah.
Um, I we I mean my one of my great heroes, of course, James Hansen wrote a paper on nuclear energy and with a statistician. And of course, again, the Green crowd didn't like him for doing that. But anyway, I shouldn't get into the argument about nuclear, but there's a big difference because we know where the pollution is.
Mm,
We know where it is. So potentially, let's say potentially, nuclear fission energy could be, right, um, uh, a really, really, really bad thing, but it's still potential,
mm.
right? Fossil fuels, it's
Exactly.
every second,
Yeah.
and it's not only oil and gas for energy. We now have plastics, right?
Mm,
We now have the fossil fuel petrochemical industry churning out, plastics at an exponential rate. And they are terrifying, Guy. They're
yeah.
absolutely terrifying. Not just because they're in my brain, which is adult enough that it doesn't need any more microplastics, I'm sure, but because they, it's well known they get everywhere, but they get everywhere where green plants are.
Mm,
And all of life on this planet, certainly on land, depends on green plants and photosynthesis and that amazing miracle of how they work. But these bloody things, micro, nano, right?
hmm
They invade roots, they invade the stems, they invade the leaves. And so they reduce the capacity of the plant to photosynthesize. Absolutely terrifying.
Mm, mm, mm. And I tell you, there's look, every organ of Gaia is under assault, every
Yeah.
organ.
Yes.
And the one that there's a field of inquiry that I started in back in 2016, when I got in my head about the ecological impact of space, the space industry. And so I've been following that, and I've actually got a website that I just rediscovered the other day that I built that basically maps out lots of this stuff. And so, like just the other day, we've launched the Artemis crew, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so they did a flyby around the moon, came back. Everyone's, apart from the toilet not working properly, it all went fine. That rocket, which is called SLS, the Space Launch Systems, that massive rocket with the white core and the two orange boosters, those boosters are the largest ever solid fuel boosters ever produced, and they burn synthetic rubber, and they leave vast troves of black carbon soot in the stratosphere as they through the atmosphere. And black carbon has got a massive, massive carbon footprint because it's got these big long chains that
Yeah.
wiggle and jiggle
Yeah.
and pick up
Indeed.
the
Indeed. Yeah.
infrared. So, like a carbon audit of that rocket launch would reveal it to have a profound impact. Now, those same similar rocket fuels, they're called nitro. Anyway, I think of the name. It's a complicated, long name. Nitrobutadiene. Um, anyway, synthetic rubber. So what they do is they mix the mold up. They mix the stuff up as a liquid, and it goes into the rocket, into the booster, and then it solidifies and it burns from the inside out as it burns out, chucking out these vast troves of soot. So that's the same fuel that Richard Branson is using in his Virgin Galactic plane. And there is I don't know if you follow this, but there's a big plane that straps the rocket underneath it. You got the passengers go into the rocket. It's a space tourism venture. The plane takes off, goes into the stratosphere, drops the rocket, which ignites its engine. And there is a photograph of this plane, this rocket being dropped, igniting its engine. And there is this thick black band of soot because this is the pre-combusted stuff. It's not properly combusted because the engine's starting up. And then it basically zooms off up to the upper atmosphere to spend some time in weightlessness before coming back down again. His plan, grand scheme, is to sell tickets for $500,000 each and do one flight a day. There is a science paper that I've got with these guys who've done the math on the black carbon, saying that if he gets his one flight a day, that one venture will have the equivalent radiative forcing of the entirety of global aviation fleet. So,
You know,
park.
I mean, that's astounding, guy. I had no idea about that. So the United States has gone into solid rocket fuel, and the worst kind of solid rocket fuel they could imagine, apparently. That's absolutely, the more you go into these things, like this particular one, what's the explanation, right? What's the possible explanation? It's insane. It's complete insanity, right? I played around with how I might express it on a social media, and I called it lunatic Mars madness.
Oh, Mars
And
Madness. That's right up there with it.
yeah,
Right up there with it. And I'll tell
I
you one
mean,
other, just
Christ, for heaven's sake, I mean, and it's part of the American NASA project they're still working on terraforming Mars. It's
yeah,
part of that
yeah,
obviously insane project, right?
yeah, yeah, yeah. So just one other. I mean, I could talk all day about Mars, right? One of my fiction novels, I don't have a close hand, is called The Martian Cat, which basically is supposed to run interference on the idea of sending people to Mars. But the other thing is, we've got these new constellations of satellites. So Starlink, which is the Elon Musk SpaceX satellites, I think he's got around, I think 10,000 or something. I don't know what the number is now. But the point is that he's got thousands of these little satellites that last for about 4 or 5 years. And whereas the larger satellites under international regulations, when they come to the end of their working life, they get boosted up into what's called a graveyard orbit, which is
Oh yeah.
basically an orbit about 600 kilometers above the Earth.
Uh-huh.
These little ones, they don't have those regulations and they basically just burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. And they are largely composed of aluminium. And so you end up with large amounts, traces of aluminium oxides and all this other chemical stuff because they come into the atmosphere at about 40,000 kilometers an hour and just like turn into vapor, leaving behind this wisp of smoke in the upper atmosphere, typically in the mesosphere, about 70 kilometers or so up, I think. And this then distributes around the whole planet and then very
Yeah.
slowly kind of rains out after it's gone through the ozone layer and perturbated. Now, so I'm mentioning those microsatellites in these big communications constellations, right? But there's another two that are actually in development. I think Google has got a mega
Yeah.
constellation planned, and the Chinese are also doing the same thing. So we've got this growing situation where we're going to have thousands of tons of aluminium oxide burning up in the upper atmosphere as per business as usual heading into the future. I mean, every single organ of this living planet is under chemical and physical assault by the Homo
Yeah.
sapiens.
Yeah. Yeah. By our insanely destructive fossil fuel civilization, which has only been around for the blink of an eye.
300
Um,
years.
uh, um, uh,
Being lost for words is
but it's not actually, it's not that NASA and the United States want to terraform Mars. It's all about war. The whole venture into space has always been about war.
yeah, yeah,
We
yeah,
call it competition or, competitiveness, or well, we've got to be bigger than China and bigger than Russia. No, it's a war-based way of thinking.
yeah,
And that tends to be what civilizations end up being. And one of the reasons why they always tend to collapse, apparently. That's a whole interesting thing that I only got involved in, I guess, a few years ago. It's just amazing. And I believe that the invention of war by human beings is um, is the worst thing that ever happened. And it's really the root cause of all of the destructiveness that we're doing now. Because people believe in war, Guy. They actually believe in war.
mm,
All my life, I've been trying to convince people that war is not a great thing and we didn't need it and we should get rid of it. But people really believe in it.
mm.
Uh, uh, so, Stonewall Jackson called war the sum of all evil. And it's a very interesting quote, by the way, because the full quote, and the quote was made before the bloody Civil War opened up. The full quote is which he said, "I can't understand why all these young men are so eager to throw themselves into bloody battle. I have seen war, and war is the sum of all evil."
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah.
That would be transformative if we could see how stupid, horrid, evil, insane war is. I mean, isn't it obvious that war is completely insane? I mean, look at the Ukraine war, Ukraine and Russia. It grinds on and on and on.
Yeah. Yeah. And then again, that's really fascinating. I don't know if you've seen the drones, I mean the drone warfare,
Yeah.
and they're using these things called fiber optic drones. Okay. So they're getting these spools of fiber optic cable. So the problem with a lot of the drones, they're kind of communicating through radio waves and they're jammable. So if you want to have a drone that doesn't get jammed, you can use these fiber optics, and it actually receives its flying instructions and it sends camera data down the fiber optic cable. But it's got like 40 kilometers of fiber optic cable in a drum on the back. Okay. So the drone flies off, spooling out this fiber optic cable, and then finds its target, hits its target, and just leaves the fiber optic cable, 5, 10, 20 kilometers of it, laying on the ground. Okay. And there is a photograph I saw of one of these battlefields where these battles have been going backwards and forwards, and the entire ground is frosted with what looks like dew. You know, when the grass gets the dew and it's
Yeah,
got
yeah,
that
yeah,
glow?
yeah,
You would
yeah.
think at first glance that this was a
Oh,
night
that makes
after
a
a
lot of
dew.
noise.
It's just a cobweb of fiber optic cables scattered around the landscape.
So
So,
consider we're using that degree of ingenuity, right? That degree of its actual creativeness. I mean, it's
oh,
amazing
hugely.
in
Cognitive.
order to kill each other.
Yeah,
I mean, Russians and Ukrainians, basically the same people,
yeah,
right? Um,
yeah,
uh, and then we have, Jewish people and Muslim people, slaughtering each other still. And of course, we have the genocide of Gaza, which is now almost certainly the worst genocide that human beings have ever created. Um, um, it is absolutely insane. And maybe if you have a very sane book, what I call your little book is full of clarity and insanity. Full of clarity and sanity, right?
yeah,
That it gives no room for any but the craziness because you're addressing in the book all the aspects of the craziness that's going on.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I remember. I mean that war's been going on for what, 4 years now.
Mm,
I mean, we're looking at the duration of the Second World War,
mm,
and in the early days, at least, I know that those drones were put together by kids, by teenagers,
mm,
because there was a documentary about how clever these teenagers were who
mm,
could put together these drones.
mm. Yeah, little 3D printers and yeah, and it's creating a whole new class of novel entities. That's sort of where I was going with that story about the fiber optic drones. I mean, quite apart from anything else, every time these things blow up, and there's thousands of these things going up every day, just imagine when you've got, I don't know, 200 grams of high explosives attached to a drone, and then it just goes puff. It's
Yeah.
creating this cloud of toxics because you've got the explosive itself, then you've got the 3D printed frame, many of which are like polycarbonate or carbon fiber, and you've got the microelectronics, and you've got the batteries, and you've got these little explosions of this dew of toxic chemicals clouded, drifting across this entire front line. And the toxification of the biosphere. I did an interview with Professor Paul Ulrich, who passed
Oh,
away.
really?
Yeah,
Wow.
I did two interviews with him. Actually, he's a great guy. But he was saying that the toxification of the biosphere, in his view, is a greater threat to life on Earth than climate is. And of course, the two things are going on simultaneously. Um, yeah,
Well, I mean, a few years ago, there was a very good idea going around which attracted the support of a lot of people. It was very simple. It was called zero pollution, right?
there's a
And
novel
and
idea.
and and of course, a great champion of that and a great mind was Buckminster Fuller,
Right.
and he actually explained how we could achieve zero pollution.
Yeah,
And then there was another man who was a green architect, and more recently, and he did the same thing. We can actually achieve zero pollution.
absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. We can do anything, you know. We got through the ice ages with archery, you know. we can do anything, but we've got to get our minds set right. We've got to have a flag on the hill that, in my philosophy is the verdant age. And
Yeah, I totally agree with that. When people say, sort of, is it too late, or we're done for, I say, well, you got to remember one thing. We still have no idea what we could do if we all of the resources, right, mental and physical, technological, of humanity were put together, directed at one cause, right, which might be to solve climate change, but it might be to create a world of zero pollution.
mm,
We really can't underestimate how much we could do.
mm. Absolutely. Yeah, I'd say that we've not yet seen a national government of a large Western country aggressively pursue climate goals. And the day that happens, it's going to turn people are going to go, "Ah, who'd have thought that they could go so fast? Who'd have
Yeah.
who'd have who'd have thought that a nation could drop its carbon footprint so rapidly? We just haven't seen anybody have a go yet."
We haven't even tried, Guy.
Yeah.
And the reason why we haven't tried is because of the pernicious, malevolent, highly successful PR. Well, it's more than PR, it's psych ops, which is being conducted against our population by the
Yeah.
fossil fuel industry,
Yeah.
for decades now. They've employed all of the very best, communicators, psychologists, all
Yeah.
those people, and they've got them all working together, right? To convince us in general that no matter that it looks like, it's destroying our future, that fossil fuels are nevertheless a very good thing, and they're not a bad thing.
Yeah. Psych ops, psychological
Yeah,
operations. Is
psycho.
that what you meant? Yeah. Propaganda.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's an army. It's a military term, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Hey, I'll tell you my favorite story in that regard is back in 2000, BP engaged an international advertising company called Ogilvy Mayer to help redeem their public image. And the BP executive said, "Look, everyone thinks that we're responsible for climate change, and there's all this pressure on us, and we're feeling the heat. Is there anything you can do?" And Ogilvy Mayer took $100 million from BP, and they created the carbon calculator concept, and they got the world to start the public to start calculating how much
Oh
greenhouse gas
yes, yes,
emissions
yeah.
they were
I
individually
can remember
producing.
now. I can remember now that originated from the fossil fuel industry,
That
right?
was that was Ogilvy Mayer,
Wow.
funded
Wow.
by BP, to
Wow.
basically say, "Hey guys, climate change is actually your responsibility.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
here's a little calculator that you can use to figure out how much you are personally responsible." Meanwhile, the fossil fuel industry was bribing and doing psychops on the
Yeah.
government to make sure that policy favored them, and there was never an alternative for the public. Fundamental.
Well, hopefully more and more people read your book and become enlightened, right? Really understand things, really understand life and themselves. And I mean, your book, of course, is calling for a great transformation. And we need nothing less than that. We need a great transformation of all humanity. Um, and that's achievable. That's doable. Um, each one, each individual, another individual. So it's up to all of us as individuals, really. And
Ultimately, individuals don't get to control governments, but individuals get to
yeah,
control the individual.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And then with a shared vision and a shared language, then a whole bunch of individuals get together to create group action. Hey, Peter, great to talk to you again.
okay.
we've been gabbing on for 2 hours now.
Oh my God, isn't that terrible? Yeah,
That's all right.
it's always a great pleasure talking to you guys,
Oh,
and,
likewise, Peter. Thanks very much.
reading about what you're up to. It's great.
Okay.
Your work is a truly great work. Um, were you aware of Thomas Berry?
I know of him, but I haven't read
Okay.
a lot of his stuff.
Oh, he was a wonderful man. So of course he lived in this part of the world, not in Canada, but fairly close to where we are right now. And every book he wrote was great. But he wrote a little book called The Great Work.
Right. Okay.
It was a wonderful book. In every age, there is a great work to be done.
Yeah.
And yeah, yeah. A guy, what I'm trying to remind people is that we do need to, with all of these horrible, horrible arsehole people around doing horrible arsehole things, we still have to remember, the really good and great people that are in our history and also around today, because all of this negative publicity sort of doesn't allow any goodness to come in, does it?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway,
Um,
that's
okay.
great.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Let's talk again soon, huh?
Okay, bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.